To see you all here. So I'm David Wharton. I'm the outgoing chair of the Environmental Stats Committee. Lachlan Asphalt will be taking over. I'm on Bedegal country and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I stand. So what we've got here is a seminar for the Tjanpi Award winner. The Tjanpi Award is something we've been offering since 2022. So this is our fifth winner. So it's for best student paper in environmental stats. And yeah, its name's Jumpy because that's the Pitjantjatjara word for spinifex grass. Spinifex is common across Central Australian. It's a long-lived keystone species, important as a source of food and shelter for all sorts of interesting species. And we named the student award after Jumpy as an analogy for their research career, which we hope is long-lived and central to all sorts of interesting discoveries. So this year, so we're going with a different format. We're doing an online seminar from the Jumpy awardee, and I'm happy to introduce Josh Jacobson, who's coming to us from Colorado. He did his PhD at Wollongong with Andrew Zamantmention, Michael Bertolucci, and Noel Cressy, working on Wombat 2.S, which is a Bayesian framework for understanding global carbon dioxide flux. So, uh, Josh, over to you.
All right. Are we seeing this okay?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Well, yeah, thanks, David, for that introduction. And yeah, I'll start off by saying that it's really a real honor to be selected for the Tjanpi Award this year. It, you know, and to be able to share this work with you all in the seminar today. Um, so I think yeah, as David.
And so,
Okay,
yeah, good to
great.
go.
Okay, cool. So yeah, just saying that the Tjanpi Award has been running for about 5 years now, and I know that this award always gets a lot of really excellent submissions. So a quick shout out to all of the other nominees this year and to the judges for making it possible. Um, so yeah, the paper that received the award this year is about Bayesian hierarchical models and CO2 flux estimation and satellite data. But it's also about wombats. And so I'll go ahead and get into that in just a minute here. Um, Although I'm at CU Boulder now, this research was conducted during my PhD in Wollongong, where the Wadi Wadi people of the Darawal country are the traditional owners of the land. And I wanted to take a quick second to pay my respects to their ancestors and elders, past and present, and extend this acknowledgement and respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that may be here today. This background image shows some tufts of Tjanpi grass drying in the sun, and of course, Aboriginal Australians have many uses for this grass, but one of those is basket making. And so during the Australian Statistical Conference in 2023, the SSA organized a basket weaving workshop that I attended. And these baskets are incredibly intricate. And so understandably, we weren't able to produce our own baskets in that workshop. But we did have time to make our own or to weave our own Tjanpi bracelets. And I wanted to bring that in here today and have a chance to show that to you all. I have it, but I'm in between moves right now, and I wasn't able to find that for this interview for this meeting. But just thought that would be a fun story to share. And yeah, anyways, let's go ahead and get into it here. Oh, and also I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge my collaborators in this work. So during my PhD, my advisors were Noel Cressy, Andrew Zamit-Manjone, and Michael Bertolacci. And on this paper, we had the opportunity to work with Andrew Shu who's a atmospheric scientist at the Colorado State University as well. And since arriving in Colorado, it's been great to have a chance to connect with him in person. Okay, so as we know, atmospheric CO2 concentrations are on the rise. Um, and in order to mitigate this, we need to understand the global carbon cycle, and in particular, the process of surface flux, which is the rate of exchange of CO2 between per unit space and per unit time between Earth's surface and its atmosphere. So according to the IPCC and others, the net surface flux averaged an increase of about 5 petagrams of carbon per year, or about 2 parts per million of CO2 over the period of 2010 to 2019. But this net flux, there are many components to it. Some of these are human caused and others occur naturally. So the largest of these natural fluxes include photosynthesis, or GPP, ecosystem respiration. Photosynthesis is strictly a sink, ecosystem respiration, which is strictly a source, and ocean air exchange, which can actually go either way. So together, the combined effect of these major natural fluxes currently absorbs about half of human emissions annually. But despite their importance, the spatial and temporal distributions of these natural fluxes are pretty poorly understood. So improving our estimates of these major natural fluxes is going to be very key to managing and mitigating climate change. The challenge with estimating these fluxes, why are they so poorly understood across spatial and temporal scales, is because these sources and sinks are really difficult to directly measure across these massive spatial regions and long time periods that we're interested in. So think about all the photosynthesis happening in the Amazon rainforest, for example. That said, it is possible to measure atmospheric concentrations of CO2, and actually, or mole fraction, and we have a lot of these data on CO2 from satellites. And so since these CO2 concentrations represent the result of the fluxes, we can work backwards from the concentrations that we see in the atmosphere to the fluxes that would have generated them at the surface in a method called flux inversion. The hang up with this is that these CO2 concentrations are only a function of the net flux. And so that's all that most flux inversion systems to date are able to determine. But remember that we're interested in isolating those different components of the net flux. And fortunately, over the last decade or so, a new data source has emerged that can help us to do that. So it turns out that when plants are conducting photosynthesis, they end up absorbing more light energy than they're actually able to make use of. And so a lot of that ends up being dissipated as heat, but a small fraction of that unused energy gets re-emitted in the form of solar-induced fluorescence, or SIF. And that SIF emission happens in the infrared spectrum, and so that's something that satellites can pick up on. So SIF is this dynamic proxy for photosynthesis, and thus the satellite SIF observations can help us to inform our estimates of GPP, and through its connection with the net flux, our estimates of the other natural fluxes as well. Okay, so an overview here for the remainder of the talk. First, I'll discuss our overall multi-process Bayesian hierarchical model. Then we'll look at a quick simulation experiment to demonstrate the utility of including those the SIF satellite observations in the framework. And finally, we'll look at results from a flux inversion with real SIF and CO2 data from satellite and other data sources as well. So first, the model here. So the model that we work with is based on a flux inversion system called WOMBAT, and that stands for the Wollongong methodology for the Bayesian assimilation of trace gases. So in version 1, WOMBAT focused on advancing the state of uncertainty quantification around the net flux. And in version 2.0, that was extended to separate out the different natural components using a system of linear constraints. So remember, for example, GPP is always negative or always a sink. However, it turns out that GPP and respiration in particular are really hard to fully disentangle using just those linear constraints alone. So in version 2S, where S stands for SIF, our aim is to take advantage of those SIF observations so that we can better separate these major natural fluxes. So Wombat version 2S builds upon those previous versions. And so first I'll give a quick overview of how the framework looked in the first two versions. At the top level of the hierarchy here in the diamond, we've got the CO2 mole fraction model, our data model, for the noisy and incomplete observations. And then we have a model for the latent mole fraction process, which is itself driven by the latent flux process. And being Bayesian, of course, we have parameters with different prior distributions at each of these levels. So the main subject of our interest here is the flux process model, and so let's take a closer look at that. We denote the flux process by x, and it's a field over both space S and time t. So this plot here is showing an estimate of a 6-year average between 2015 and 2020. And the goal here is really just to introduce our notation and the idea of this field. But for reference, these particular estimates come from what's called or what's known as a bottom-up understanding of the different mechanistic processes involved. So think about kind of these theoretical models of how energy is conserved and spread and distributed throughout the ecosystem. So on that last slide, we saw that there's quite a bit of spatial structure in this net flux process. And if we zoom in on a single one of those grid cells, we can see that there's also a lot of temporal structure. So this plot here, this top panel of our plot here, is showing both natural and fossil fluxes for this single grid cell. Over the course of the period that we're interested in here. And the fossil fuel fluxes, which is the black dashed line, show basically no variation at this scale, this magnitude. But in green, we have our natural fluxes, and there's this large annual variation or seasonal cycle. And that is what Wombat version 2 in particular looks to build a model around, is that seasonality. So here's how that's done in version 2, and we take the same approach in Wombat version 2S. So to start, at each location and time, we treat the net flux as the sum of several different components, including our principal natural components, GPP, respiration, ocean fluxes, etc., as well as our human-related emissions. Now, each of those components may be subject to certain physical constraints. So, for example, again, GPP going to be negative. And then with each of those components, we have this time varying or a time series model that varies by location. And so that model is decomposed into 3 broad terms. We have this linear term capturing any long-term trends, a seasonal term, and a residual. So the unknowns here are the spatially varying beta parameters in the linear and seasonal terms, and then the spatiotemporal residual epsilon. And so these are the main quantities that we want to infer. Between all the various flux components, GPP, respiration, ocean fluxes, and each of the many different beta and epsilon terms, this is a very high dimensional problem. And after discretization across space and time, we're looking at a dimensionality here on the order of 10 to the 9th. So in order to conduct inference before the heat death of the universe and keep our computations tractable here, we need some form of dimension reduction. And in Wombat, we reduce dimensionality using a basis function model. So our basis function model is our basis functions are constructed from those bottom-up estimates of the different components. Using those bottom-up estimates, we construct these initial estimates of the time series components, the betas and the epsilons. We call those beta naught and epsilon naught. And then we end up rescaling those bottom-up estimates using random and unknown scaling factors 1 plus alpha. So we do this rescaling region by region for the betas because they're only varying with space. And then then the 23 regions that we're looking at here are known as transcom regions. There are 11 for land and 11 for the oceans. And we do the rescaling region by month for the spatiotemporal residual. So the big picture here is that we get this basis function model for each of the component fluxes, and that's governed by this unknown vector alpha here, which has around, between all the flux components, alpha has around 6,000 elements altogether. So that's down from 10 to the ninth before dimension reduction. So in principle, Wombat version 2 can determine these coefficients for each of GPP, respiration, etc., by enforcing linear constraints on each of the component fluxes. In practice, though, for the GPP and respiration linear terms especially, it turns out that that's pretty difficult to do using just those linear constraints. So this figure here is illustrating that issue. And in the top row, we have our global monthly GPP estimates, our GPP and respiration estimates from our SIP4 bottom-up estimates, the biosphere model there. And then Wombat version 2's posterior estimates in blue. And then down the rows, we have the decomposition into the linear, seasonal, and residual terms. And so because of this issue with identifiability between GPP and respiration, Wombat version 2 needed to fix the respiration linear term to its bottom-up SIB4 estimate. So this term is not inferred in Wombat version 2. And in turn, that puts a pretty strong constraint on the GPP linear term as well through the connection to the net flux. So this is where the SIF observations can be especially useful to us. So by helping us to better pin down GPP and its linear term, we can thereby also infer the respiration linear term in Wombat version 2S. All right, so we have pretty good reason to include these SIF observations in our framework, and now I'll talk about how we do that. So in Wombat version 2S, we extend the hierarchical model with 2 new levels for SIF. And since we model each of the flux components separately, we can link the SIF process model directly to the GPP component flux here. Now, one of the most important developments here is that our updated model graph is finally starting to look a little bit like a wombat. So if you squint your eyes a little bit here, you can hopefully see that. And there we go. So how do we go ahead and do this? We want to link SIF to that GPP process. And there's been a great deal of research on what is that relationship between SIF and GPP. And at the scale of a single leaf, we know that that relationship is pretty complex. But let me clarify here that the resolution that we're talking about within this work is the SIF signal that a satellite sees. So one that's emitted by an entire field or canopy. And at this larger scale, more aggregate scale, the relationship is actually quite linear, but it's a linear relationship that varies across space and time. So for instance, the type of linearity is going to vary across regions as we have maybe the dominant plant type changes from something like a crop field to more of a rainforest. And even within a given region, that linearity will be modulated by seasons as temperatures fluctuate, etc. So the main idea for our SIF process model is to treat SIF as a function of GPP, and we'll call that function HSIF. And we want to allow that relationship to vary in space and time, like we just talked about. We also know that there are going to be other factors that can affect SIF independently of GPP, such as the probability of reabsorption of those light photons before they actually escape the canopy. And so we represent those kind of effects with this residual process nu. But again, the main subject of interest here is this function HSIF. And to study that, we again turn to the SIB4 biosphere model. So SIB4 already provides our estimates that form our prior for GPP, and we call those X naught GPP. And it turns out that SIB4 also produces these bottom-up estimates of SIF. So at a given location and time, we adopt a linear relationship here between SIF and GPP using a Taylor series expansion around the SIB4 GPP estimate. So what happens here is that we treat SIB4 as this imperfect representation of the true HSIF here. And so we call that relation, we call SIB4 H hat. And so the first term in our Taylor series expansion here becomes SIB4's representation of SIF. And then we have the derivative here, H1, or in other words, the sensitivity of SIF to GPP. So I'll save the discussion of how we derive this derivative for later if there's time. But the unknowns here that we're trying to determine are this posterior adjustment to that bottom-up estimate of GPP, as well as the error introduced by using SIB4 as an imperfect model, as well as this linearization through the Taylor series expansion. And those are captured in our spatiotemporal random error term that also incorporates the effects that are not due to GPP. So then, through linearity, this relationship, this expansion becomes a basis function model for the SIF process as well. So the basis vectors here, psi, those are the basis vectors for the GPP process times this sensitivity term, that SIF GPP sensitivity term. And so for the sake of time, again, I won't go into how these two equations connect. And I'll also be glancing over the SIF data model here. But the big idea is that through this hierarchical structure, we're able to link observations of SIF directly to these basis function coefficients for the GPP basis vectors. Okay, so a lot of equations here. Don't stress. We've already looked at most of them. But a couple of important details that I haven't discussed so far are the CO2 process model and data model. One important detail is that the SIF and CO2 mole fraction data models ultimately have this similar additive form. So that means that we can use a grouped data model and treat SIF as kind of a new group in this overall structure. And then through this sort of ladder of hierarchical relationships, we're taking observations of mole fraction and SIF, working backwards through the respective process models to look at how those are driven by the underlying flux process, and ultimately being able to connect those observations to that vector alpha of basis function coefficients that we want to make inference on. So putting it all together, we can stack our observations into one long vector Z and arrive at a familiar random effects type model. So here we have a known mean, Z naught, and through linearity, again, those basis functions become basis functions on the SIF and CO2 mole fraction process. And then the error terms in these processes add to any correlated observation error, which we capture separately from any uncorrelated observation error. And to estimate the fluxes, we make inference on these basis function coefficients alpha. And so since the fluxes, remember, are constrained constrained to follow physical constraints like non-negativity and non-positivity, we use a constrained or truncated multivariate Gaussian distribution for alpha, where this constraint set F alpha is a set of linear constraints that are applied element-wise. Then we have a combination of correlated and uncorrelated errors that we model independently as Gaussian. And then we have unknown parameters that govern the covariance structure for alpha, as well as the two error terms. And those are assigned priors as well. So as a reminder, here we have about 6,000 parameters to make inference on. And most of those are the elements of alpha. And we're using a Gibbs scheme here to iterate between alpha and the other parameters. So for sampling alpha, we employ a Hamiltonian Monte Carlo method that solves the Hamiltonian equations of motion exactly, which enables this projection-free sampling from that constrained multivariate Gaussian. And for the other parameters, we're using a sequential slice sampling, which avoids rejection sampling again and adapts to that local shape of the target distribution. And before getting into the results here, here's a quick overview of how this is configured. We've got a lot of diverse data sources. The main one is the NASA's OCO2 satellite, which makes simultaneous retrievals of SIF and CO2 mole fraction. We also bring in situ and flask observations from a variety of sources, each with different error characteristics. And so altogether, we have about 2 million observations here, and we're also making use of various bottom-up estimates and an atmospheric transport model. And putting it all together, we produced these estimates during the period, 6-year period from January 2015 to December 2020, with quantified uncertainties on all of our unknowns. So this whole process takes about 2 days on the HPC at UOW. So first, I'll run through a quick simulation experiment where we can look at the utility of including those SIF observations. So in an Aussie, the idea is to come up with a value for the true flux so that we know what we want to get. And then using those known true fluxes, we can simulate noisy observations of SIF and CO2 using our data model. And then from those noisy observations, we look to recover the true flux under different configurations for the inversion, such as with the SIF observations included or not. And then we can compare the resulting estimates to the true flux using validation statistics like the RMSE or continuous rank probability score. Okay, so this plot is showing the global decomposition of those Aussie estimates of GPP, respiration, and their sum, NEE. So NEE is essentially the net flux over land. And looking at the top left and middle panels here, the posterior estimates with SIF included, those are the green lines here. Those are sitting right on the truth, and that is in black. And so this is a little bit difficult to see in these panels, and that's due to the scale of the uncertainty in the posterior estimates where SIF is not included. And the point here really is that these SIF estimates are very highly informative of that GPP linear term, which also then allows us to characterize that respiration linear term. On the other hand, this top right panel is showing that the net flux is already well constrained by the CO2 mole fraction observations, and so including SIF doesn't really impact those posterior estimates. Okay, so SIF is it seems like it's super useful for GPP and respiration, and so let's take a look at how it impacts our results with some real data. So the first thing that we'll look at here is monthly global flux estimates for GPP, respiration, and again, their sum NEE. This plot here is showing the SIB4 estimates that form our prior in gray. We've got the Wombat version 2.0 and 2.S estimates, and then estimates from an independent framework called FluxCom. So looking at the top panel, the first thing we see is that the compared to Wombat version 2, the inclusion of SIF in 2S leads to a much larger seasonal amplitude in our GPP estimates. And the amplitudes for the respiration estimates are also larger in Wombat version 2S. But another really interesting thing here is that that inclusion of the SIF observations in Wombat version 2S pulls the seasonal cycle for respiration back into alignment with the SIB4 bottom-up estimate, as well as with that independent FluxCom framework. And so that has some pretty important implications in terms of the timing of major CO2 emissions. And lastly here, as we saw in the Aussie, SIF doesn't have much influence on the NEE global totals here, but if we take a look at the decomposition of these fluxes, we actually see that the linear trend in NEE has gone from having a slightly negative slope in version 2.0 to having a slightly positive one in Wombat version 2.S. Now, this is happening due to the added flexibility in our model. So we're actually inferring the respiration linear term here in 2S, where it was not in version 2.0. So that's made possible by the inclusion of SIF, but this update is not because of those SIF observations like we saw in the Aussie. Now, unfortunately, what this means is that instead of increasingly compensating for human emissions, what we're seeing here is that Earth is actually absorbing less and less CO2 on average. So a natural question to ask here is where is this average decrease in CO2 uptake happening? And that's the last thing we'll look at here. So the map on the left is showing the posterior means for the difference in the slope parameter between version 2S and 2.0 by grid cell. And then on the right, we have the posterior, the standard deviation, posterior standard deviations in those differences. So on the left, we've got red indicating a decreased rate of CO2 uptake when SIF is included, and that's happening mainly in these tropical and temperate regions, but the change is actually flipped as we move farther to the north or to the south. And so this is just a hypothesis, but that might suggest that SIF is picking up on something like human land use change, which isn't reflected, or which is reflected through reduced photosynthetic activity, but not controlled for in our model otherwise, or in those bottom-up estimates otherwise. So uncertainty quantification is a strength of our approach here, and we can look at our confidence in these differences. And on the right, we see that the uncertainties tend to be pretty low overall, but they are the largest in the tropical regions. And that happens because, number one, we have the fewest observations in tropical regions, and also the seasonal cycles are much less pronounced there. Okay, so I'll leave you with a few key points here. The carbon cycle is changing in response to human influences, and it's really important that we're able to understand why. We showed that we can see some of these changes in a flux inversion framework using a rigorous statistical approach. And we also showed that these SIF observations can be really useful for characterizing the major natural processes like GPP and respiration, which are the most uncertain elements in our understanding of the carbon cycle. I also want to emphasize that Wombat wouldn't have been possible without the help of many experts in the atmospheric sciences. And it's those kind of close collaborations that lead us to better informed decision-making about climate change and its mitigation. So here's the lineage of Wombat so far, and there's still a lot of detail to get into. So if you're interested, definitely encourage you to take a look at these publications. And I'll leave you with a few of our key references for this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. Any questions?
Can I ask a question? I know I'm a supervisor, but this is a Dorothy Dix question, Josh. Could you say something about the fine scale variation and how you're able to pick that up in the paper, and whether there are more things to do on that front?
Yeah. So with that basis function decomposition, the coefficients are ultimately for many of the terms in the model resolved at the spatial scale of the transcom regions. So let me go back to that here. So those are pretty coarse, and so ultimately we're making inference at a spatial scale that's across these large regions. But the fine scale variation still is preserved through the each of the bottom up estimates are resolved at a resolution of about 2 by 2.5 degrees, and so the structure in those bottom up estimates remains, and so we still have that in our ultimate estimates. And it's just that the variability then comes in at this coarser resolution. So definitely, in the long run, we'd love to get our estimates to be inferred directly at that 2 by 2.5 degree or somewhere in between, a little bit finer resolution. And so that's definitely something that is a matter for future work. In part, it's limited to the resolution that we can get is limited by the resolution of the atmospheric transport model. And so that is another area where we kind of need the ability to run transport models at higher resolutions with sort of a trade-off in the cost for doing so. Does that
Thank you. Yeah, that's
sort of
great.
address your question, Noel?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Any other questions? Lynn.
Hi. Lynn?
Thank you. Oh, sorry, there's one in the chat as well that's probably the
Oh, you
chat
want to do
might
the
be
chat
better
first?
first. Is that all
Okay.
right?
Okay, so Saha asks, how sensitive are your posterior flux estimates and the reported reversal in global carbon dioxide absorption to the choice of priors? Have you tested
Yeah,
alternative priors to
yeah,
look at
yeah. Very
reversal?
good question. So we have this in that reversal, we have the same prior being used in version 2 as was used in version 2S. We have not swapped this out for a different biosphere model. There are a couple of other options out there that would be possible to use. That would definitely be something to look at. But at least in terms of the let me see if I can go back to that slide here. In terms of our posterior credible intervals, of course, it would be found to be statistically significant. They're not covering they're not covering zero on the slope, but definitely something to look at, swapping out for a different underlying biosphere model to help form the prior.
Okay, just on the question of sensitivity to some of the decisions along the way. So you used a basis function approach.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the basis that you were using there? Was
Yes.
that was that the cos sine thing or no?
Yes, that's right. So
Oh yeah, okay.
each of the go back to this. So each flux component, say GPP, has multiple different terms in this time series decomposition. And so each one of these, so let's just look at the intercept, for example. That is a spatial field. And the basis functions here are just we apply an indicator function that says, are we in Transcom region 3 or Transcom region 2? And so the basis functions are, we basically have 23 fields for just this one term. Either going to be the value of that, the estimated value from that bottom up estimate, or it's going to be zero. And it just depends on whether we're in, that in the region or outside of the region being indexed. So those are the underlying basis functions, and then those get scaled.
So it's like a step function from the sounds of
Yeah,
it.
it's like
It's a step
so
function
say
across these
if
values.
if we're in region 2, we've got the value of the intercept in region 2, and then the rest of the basis function there is 0 everywhere else, or the basis function for the intercept in region 17 is whatever it is, whatever those bottom up values are for the intercept in region 17, and then 0 everywhere else. So kind of like a spatial, you just get that region isolated and its coefficients in that region.
Right. And so were you thinking about looking at other options to that? That was getting to Noel's question about fine scale variation, like
Yeah,
looking at
so
other
yeah, we
ways
can
to
definitely
specify a spatial field.
yeah, you can definitely think about different decompositions. So of course, with this one, as course it is, we still end up with 6,000 parameters that we need to determine, or actually more. And so as we start to decrease the size of these regions or think about a different basis function decomposition, we get more and more parameters. So there's this trade-off between dimension reduction and between tractability and coarseness of the model.
Yeah.
Okay. May I have a question?
Go for it.
Thank you for your presentation, and your paper was fantastic. As you mentioned, there is more than 6,000 parameters affect in different zone and different categories, something like that. Okay. I was for decomposition. I was wondering, for example, without considering the zone, um, did you do some, for example, scenario-based modeling, for example, consider the most important factor and what will happen if, for example, this factor, for example, as an example, for example, is one standard deviation decrease or increase or something like that?
I'm not quite following the question. So if we had if we were to change like the underlying, is this kind of getting back to that bottom up estimate aspect, or
Mhm.
could
Yes.
you maybe?
Yes, for example, between these 6,000 parameters, you mentioned that, okay?
Yeah,
Did you consider uh, what is the most important factors? Okay, and when, for
yeah,
example, if find, for example, between 6,000 factor, maybe most important factors, maybe 5 or 10 factors, something like that. And for example,
yeah,
if between this, for example, if for example one of these factor or a mix of this factor, for example, if for example A increase one standard deviation, B decrease one standard deviation, or C increase 10%, for example, is something like a scenario modeling. Okay, what will
I
happen? The
see. Yeah,
result.
yeah. No, that's a good question. We have not considered something like that, but I think the most important factors here, I mean, it's kind of there's all the different elements of the alpha vector, which is the basis function coefficients. There's the
Mhm.
other parameters that we're estimating also pertain to the data model and the observation error structure. And so yeah, the different parameters that are being estimated, they're all kind of specific to how the model is formulated. It would be, let's see, yeah, it would be interesting maybe to like start by and something that sort of tried initially was just fix maybe the data model parameters and just estimate the alphas and see how are we doing there, get an initial guess,
Yes.
and then kind of go back and change things in more of an iterative fashion.
Mhm.
We haven't considered a sort of full-blown uh, experimental design for this, but that would be interesting to sort of elucidate, which are the more influential factors. Um, I would imagine for the alphas, it would come down to some of the more impactful regions. So areas like the tropics that emit and absorb a lot of CO2.
Yes.
So what our estimates for those regions are going to be probably the most significant. And thinking about maybe just fixing some of the elements and estimating those directly would be interesting to look at. Yeah.
Yes, yes, thank you. Thank you for it. So I understand maybe it's something I say that is not in a scope of your research or a scope of based on your, for example, hypothesis or based on your goals. But I was wondering maybe we consider that, for example, we can then find what would be the worst case scenario and moving forward to more sustainable situation, help us to something like a risk management and yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. Um, Yeah, and kind of tying that back to other folks' questions about the different basis function constructions and finer scale resolutions. One interesting thing might be to have a sort of a multi-scale grid or
Mhm.
in these regions that are very significant have a lot more basis functions in a high resolution there, and then allow the resolution to be coarser in other regions where it's less impactful, the variability is less
Exactly.
impactful. So
Yes,
yeah, that could be
exactly.
really.
Thank you. Thank you. Well done. And it was fantastic, your research.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
We should, I think, just about wrap it up there. So could everyone join me again in thanking Josh for his time? It's now just about 6 o'clock over in Colorado. Thanks again for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And it was a really interesting talk.